Greetings, it's Adam with IratA and I'm not dead, not disappeared or abducted or whatever. I've been around. I've just been very busy because I have basically 4 jobs, one of which is this Arcade Heroes channel, where that one actually generates revenue and such, and IratA would, but I guess I'm not allowed to have multiple channels that generate revenue unless I set it up in a different way. But recently there was a trade show in Orlando, Florida, that was kind of the Super Bowl of the arcade industry, or the E3 of the arcade industry, called IAPA. And it happens every year around November, but I was there in Orlando all week and shooting a lot of video, and I'm still working through a lot of those. And so that's been soaking up most of my time that isn't involving some of the other jobs that I have to do, which includes running my own arcade business. And so being that busy, I just had to put some other things to the side, but wanted to at least, hopefully this isn't the last video of the year for IratA, but in the event that I can't get around to something else, I at least want to get one more thing out before it gets too far off, and that is dealing with the Atari 7800 Plus, which should have, oh, there we go, there's their correct tab. And now, if somebody's already broached this subject, then apologies for repeating, I guess. I haven't had time to look through the other Atari channels who regularly discuss this stuff and see if they've already touched on this subject. But the 7800, as this image basically puts forth, it came out in 1986. Was supposed to come out in 1984, but long story short, ended up coming out in 1986, which was a year after the NES had landed on the scene, and essentially, for the most part, not completely, I think it gets maybe too much credit at reviving the arcade industry. The gaming industry. There were some great games that were coming out in arcades in 1984, and then 85, that were helping plant the seeds for the resurrection of the industry as well. And so it wasn't, I don't think, single-handedly the NES, although obviously it did a lot of the heavy lifting. But either way, the NES did change things. It was revolutionary, and one of those major things for it was the release of Super Mario Brothers. And even though I was a small kid at the time, I remember distinctly just the hype that surrounded Super Mario Brothers, and it went from 85 throughout the 80s. Culminating with like Super Mario Brothers 3 or even Super Mario World on the SNES. People were hyped up about Super Mario Brothers. The way that kids talked about it back in the day was the same way that kids talk about Minecraft or Fortnite now. And so it was like the popular video game, and it was the one that everybody wanted to copy. Now, that was a pack-in game with the NES. Now, there was the Sega Master System, which was also released in 1986, and no, it didn't come with a great pack-in title either. I mean, compared to Super Mario Brothers is what I'm going to say here. So before you stone me or decide to click off the video, what I'm saying here is that the games that were pack-ins for either the Sega Master System or the 7800 were not bad games in themselves, but I don't think that they were the best choice for the pack-in title. Now, the 7800, it came with Pole Position 2, which again, fantastic arcade game and very fun game, but up against something like Super Mario Brothers, I think that was a very poor choice. What do you think? You don't know?
I don't even know what you're talking about.
Okay, that's fine. And so the 7800 Plus, in my view, it fixes this problem because it has a pack-in of Bentley Bear's Crystal Quest. And so on Atari.com and under collections, this is where you can find the bundles and such. But I didn't realize they had the Game On Mega Bundle, which comes with all the new releases and such. But Bentley Bear's Crystal Quest was actually a homebrew by Robert De Crescenzo. Hopefully I got that right. And it's a fantastic game. I've played it. I have it. And I wouldn't mind getting this version, even though I don't think there's anything that's really changed on it. But this was designed as a 2D platformer game, and it filled up a pretty glaring gap in the 7800 library. Now, the 7800 eventually got Scrapyard Dog, which was released in 1990, but when you had 4 years of basically no platformers, mostly arcade ports and a few other things here and there, and you had Nintendo on the rampage, selling millions and millions of units, and a lot of that was thanks to the likes of Super Mario Brothers. Not entirely, but I mean there was a ton of other platformers on the NES that were obviously inspired by Nintendo. And I remember coming across some old magazines where the Atari fans had a lot of Super Mario envy. And the 7800 did get Mario Brothers Arcade and Donkey Kong Jr. And so they were thinking like, hey, if we got these Nintendo games for the system, why don't we get Super Mario Brothers? But obviously that was never going to happen. Nintendo wasn't stupid and wasn't going to release their star game on a rival console like that. And so even though this is not quite 40 years, but almost 40 years late, I think it's correcting an old mistake. And because, again, Pole Position 2, great game, but it shouldn't have been the pack-in title. Now, let's say we had a DeLorean with a flux capacitor, and we could go back to 1985 when Back to the Future came out, or 1986. And try to get Atari to do something else. Now, let's assume, or maybe it's better to say, what if Atari had somebody in place in their group at the time who was like, hey, we should have something that better competes with Super Mario Brothers for the pack-in instead of a game that at that point was already 4 years old from arcades, didn't have even maybe not even a quarter of the content, and was a fine racing game, but that up against a game where you have a bunch of levels and different enemies and secrets and power-ups and all that stuff that made Super Mario Brothers that great game that it was. You needed something probably along those lines. And so what might have they done, let's say with the mentality in 1986, like, hey, we have to have a response. I imagine that with that sort of thinking, they might have come up with something maybe kind of like Crystal Quest. I mean, probably wouldn't have been exactly like it. It probably would have been a lot more Super Mario Brothers than this is, as this game is. If you haven't played it before, it's more like Wonder Boy 3 for the Master System, if I'm recalling that one correctly. And so it might have been like Bentley Bear Bros or something. But I think that still would have been a better thing for them to have created and put in as a pack-in title. But it's not the only possibility. One that comes to mind that perhaps Atari could have worked with somebody on is Pitfall 2. Pitfall 2, The Lost Caverns, had come out in 1984 for both the Atari 2600 and the 5200. This is the 5200 version, which doesn't actually look a whole lot better than the 2600 version, just a little bit. But I remember playing Pitfall 2 as a kid before I think I had encountered Super Mario Brothers, and I really enjoyed it. And with the connections that Atari had to some degree with Activision and such, I kind of have to think that, imagine if they had gone to Activision, it's like, hey, we want a new version of Pitfall 2, maybe even Pitfall 3 for the 7800 that we could put in as a packing. Can we work on this and make this our exclusive? that could have been good, as long as it didn't end up like Super Pitfall in the NES, which was terrible. But if you had, say, this adventure game, maybe give Pitfall Harry an inventory or a whip or something, in addition to what he already had there. Or don't even have any of that and just kind of do Pitfall 2 with even better graphics and a third cavern or a fourth cavern or even more. I mean, it was a huge game, each cavern, and so you probably didn't need more than 3. But still, that would have also been a good one, just in case nobody had had the idea of, hey, let's put Bentley Bear into the role of a platforming hero. One last one that comes to mind is, like, again, this imagining some people sitting around at Atari and they're actually given a budget and it's like, hey, we need to have a good response to Super Mario Brothers, as opposed to, hey, let's just phone it in with pole position too, is combat. Now, I've argued with somebody once on Atari Age once, but I think I didn't explain myself clearly. Now, when I say combat, I don't think of doing it exactly like the Atari 2600 version with just some better graphics. I think something more along the lines of Master Blaster, which did have platforming elements as well as exploration elements. And so imagine, sure, with combat you would want to have arenas for multiplayer, but in the story mode, make it more like Countermeasure, which was on the Atari 5200. And then in Countermeasure was just more driving a tank through cities and getting to a certain place in enough time, shooting enemies and whatnot. And you could still have elements like that with combat, but you could expand it with more vehicles, maybe add in elements of frontline or commando, but also you could have it where your character gets out of your vehicle, goes into an area, and then it turns into a 2D platformer like Master Blaster, sorry. I'm getting them all confused now. I have played the game before, I promise, but just escaping me the exact positioning of the names. But something like that with combat with a storyline and platforming elements as well as combat elements. And I also think that a newer combat should have had other types of military vehicles, say submarines, as there was an Atari arcade game called Subs, where you could have that, where it was very much like combat. You could even incorporate Space Wars, so you could have spaceships and such. But again, for me, the multiplayer aspect would be arenas, but then the story mode would be more like something like Master Blaster. But what do you think Atari should have done back in 1986? Do you agree with me that with the 7800 Plus that they are fixing the past by including Crystal Quest? Also, what do you think about the other new releases that they have done for the 7800? I mean, it is really nice to see some re-releases of these old games which may not have gotten a really fair shake back in the day. I mean, the 7800 did sell okay, nowhere near as much as the 2600. It was 3.7 million units is what the 7800 managed, which was alright. It was better than the Jaguar or the Lynx or the ST, but still the 2600 did something like 30 million or more. And so just not as many people got to experience a lot of these games back in the day. And now, thanks to Pac-Man Plus, as he's known on Atari Age, we've got even more games there, including Berserk for the 7800, Frenzy, Bounty Bob Strikes Back, Asteroids Deluxe Space Duel, and hopefully we'll get even more games, but that probably depends on whether or not the 7800 Plus is a success. But let me know what your thoughts are on that. If you disagree entirely, that's cool too. If you thought that Pole Position 2 is the right one to go, but my argument is if you had something like a platformer, whether it was Crystal Quest or Pitfall 2 or 3, or combat with platforming elements, or something else entirely, a new Yar's Revenge, anything else, I think it might have helped sell a lot more than 3.7 million units. That's my argument. We'll see if it holds up. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you in the next video, whenever that happens to be. Otherwise, catch me over on Arcade Heroes.